The great hall of Ironvein Keep hummed with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the very stone walls. Elara Nighthollow stood motionless at the center of the vaulted chamber, her long, raven black, wavy hair cascading past her shoulders, catching the amber glow of 1,000 flickering candles. The charcoal gray wool cloak draped across her delicate frame with its tarnished silver clasp felt impossibly heavy, as though the weight of the entire pack's expectations had been sewn into its seams. Her emerald green eyes, which she had spent the morning trying to warm with hope, now felt hollow, vast pools of green glass reflecting the firelight without feeling it. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled her nostrils, mingling with the musk of wolf and wild earth that marked every werewolf in the grand hall. And more than 200 members of the Ironvein pack had gathered for the mating ceremony, the formal ritual that would bind her, the daughter of the old Nighthollow clan, to their alpha leader. Cale Ironvein stood across the circle from her, a towering figure of barely restrained power. Even in stillness, his broad shoulders seemed to command the air itself. His dark brown, almost black curly hair had been brushed back from his forehead with careful precision, revealing the sharp planes of his face, strong angular jaw, prominent cheekbones, and those stormy gray-blue eyes that had remained unreadable throughout the evening. A thin scar traced through his left eyebrow, a mark of some ancient battle that made him appear even more formidable. The dark brown leather armor, with its quilted padding, hugged his muscular frame, and the enormous wolf fur cloak, with its thick gray-brown collar, draped majestically across his shoulders. An iron wolf head buckle caught the light from the great fireplace, gleaming like a promise written in metal. The elder priestess, aged beyond measure, with hair white as bone and eyes clouded with the wisdom of decades, moved slowly between them with the ceremonial bowl. Her voice, though thin and reedy, carried the weight of ancient law as she began the binding words. The pack's song rose around them, a low melodic hum that seemed to come from the very earth, from centuries of matings conducted in this hall, from the bonds that held the pack together through death and darkness. But there was something brittle about this ceremony, something that tasted like frost on Alara's tongue when she dared to breathe. She had known, of course, what this mating meant. Every unmarried woman in the Nighthollow clan had known. When the elders had come to her father's cottage in the mountains 3 months ago, their faces grave and formal, she had understood before they even spoke the words. The Ironvein pack and the Nighthollow clan needed to be united. For generations, they had existed in uneasy neutrality, separated by hundreds of miles of wild forests and competing territories. But the rising threat of the rogue packs to the north, those who rejected the ancient laws, who hunted for sport rather than sustenance, who killed without the pack's consent, had made the elders fear. They had decided that blood would bind what politics could not. The daughter of the Nighthollow clan would become the Luna of Ironvein, and the two packs would be one. And no one had asked Elara what she wanted. No one had inquired whether she felt any pull toward the Alpha, whether his scent stirred her blood, whether she could imagine carrying his children into a future written in moonlight and fur. These things did not matter in the mathematics of pack politics. She was 24 years old, of perfect breeding age, and she carried within her the ancient knowledge of her clan, the old ways that were dying, the languages of negotiation that older werewolves had nearly forgotten. Her lineage made her valuable. Her heart made no difference at all. The ceremony continued. The priestess traced a mark on Ilara's forehead with ash and moonflower oil, then did the same to Kyle. The words of binding spilled from ancient lips in the old tongue, the pre-language of the werewolves, before human speech had corrupted their pure communication. Ilara's lips moved, forming the responses she had been taught. She felt numb, as though she were watching herself from above, watching a girl in a simple dark blue-gray linen dress, speaking vows she had never chosen. The worn brown leather boots on her feet felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. She had met Cale Ironvein only 5 times before this ceremony, 5 formal occasions where she had been presented to him as one might present a mare at auction. He had been polite, courteous. He had asked about her journey from the Night Hollow territories. He had inquired about the health of her family. He had shown her the Ironvein Keep with what seemed like genuine pride, walking her through halls lined with portraits of his ancestors, explaining the strategic importance of their position, the strength of their numbers. But he had never once looked at her as though she was someone he wanted. Never once had his expression shifted into anything that resembled desire, or even curiosity, or even mild affection. Perhaps she had been foolish to hope for such a thing. Perhaps she had been foolish to think that fate, magic, or the will of their wolf selves might override the calculation of politics. Werewolves were supposed to have mates, destined partners whose very scent made the beast within sing with recognition. But there were exceptions. There had always been exceptions. Forced matings, political unions, bonds of duty rather than desire. They were rare enough that the pack had a different word for them. The bonds of iron, they called them. Not the bonds of destiny, but bonds of steel. The priestess raised the ceremonial goblet to Ilara's lips, then to Cale's. The blood wine, darkly sweet and laced with herbs, slipped across her tongue. The pack's humming intensified. Around the great hall, she could see familiar faces watching with what she thought was pity. Her father, tall and gray-haired, stood near the pillars with his hand over his heart. Her mother had wept before the ceremony began and had retired to the guest chambers rather than watch her daughter be bound to a stranger in a distant keep. When it was done, the priestess announced the binding in a voice that seemed to carry all the authority of the ancient moon itself. The packs are joined. The Luna is recognized. The Ironvein pack is whole. The cheer that erupted from the assembled werewolves was deafening. Hands clapped. Voices howled. The sound of celebration filled the stone hall until Ilara thought her head might split. She kept her expression serene, her posture perfect, her emerald eyes fixed on some distant point above the crowd. She had been trained well in the appearance of composure. That, at least, had not failed her. Kyle stepped toward her, raised her hand to his lips in a formal gesture of acceptance, and the crowd roared again. She felt the warmth of his skin against hers, noticed the calluses on his palm that spoke of sword work and fighting, smelled the earth and leather, and something wild that was purely his. For just a moment, she allowed herself to look into those gray-blue eyes. She found them utterly unreachable, like looking into a storm that would never break, that would never rain, that would simply rage forever in the distance. The feast lasted until midnight. Long tables were laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, endless wine. The pack members made toasts to the new Luna, to the union of their clans, to the strength this mating would bring. Kyle sat beside her as custom demanded, and they moved through the motions of a bonded pair. He carved meat for her plate. He poured her wine. He placed his hand on her lower back when they moved from the feasting hall to the great room where dancing had begun. Any observer would have seen a perfect match. The powerful alpha and his new mate, a beautiful woman whose lineage was as distinguished as his own. But as the night deepened and the fires burned lower, Kyle's attention seemed to drift. His eyes, more than once, it found Serena Ashford across the room, tall and curvaceous, with auburn copper-red hair styled in elegant braids, amber brown eyes that held a calculating intelligence Ilara recognized immediately as dangerous. Serena wore a rich emerald green velvet dress with gold embroidery that caught the light, a dark green fur-trimmed cloak, gold rings on nearly every finger. She was watching Kale with an intensity that made Ilara's stomach clench, and he was watching her in return, not as an alpha might observe any member of his pack, but as a man observes a woman he wants. The realization landed with the force of a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through Ilara's chest that made it difficult to breathe. It was well past midnight when Kyle finally excused them both, in offering the formal explanation that the newly bonded pair should rest after the exhausting ceremony. The pack accepted this with knowing smiles and crude jests that made Ilara's face burn with shame. He walked her to the chambers that had been prepared, a grand suite that smelled of fresh flowers and expensive furs, with a bed large enough to sleep an entire small family. The moment the door closed behind them, Kyle moved to the fireplace and stood with his back to her, his massive shoulders radiating tension. "I apologize," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel, "for the formality of all this. I know it was not your choice." Ilara stood near the door, still in her wedding cloak, still holding her composure like a shield. "It was not your choice either." "No." He turned to face her, and she saw something dark and painful flicker across his features before he controlled it. "But I am alpha. Duty is simply different for me. Perhaps I should not have allowed politics to dictate something so fundamental." She did not know what to say to that. What did he mean? Was he expressing regret at their bonding, or at the larger system that had made such bondings possible? Kale moved toward the door that connected to an adjacent chamber. The Alpha's private rooms, she understood. "Rest," he said, and his voice held a strange tenderness that made her chest ache. "We will speak more clearly in the morning." But then he paused at the threshold. His hand gripped the frame, and she saw his knuckles whiten under the strain. "Ilara," he said, and his voice was so quiet she barely heard it. "You were never my choice. You understand that, don't you? The elders made this decision, not me, never me." The words fell like ice water into her veins. She had known this intellectually, in the distant way one knows abstract facts, but hearing him say it, hearing the finality in his voice, the way it sounded almost like an apology for her very existence, something within her seemed to shatter. "Yes," she whispered, "I understand." He nodded, and then he was gone, closing the door between them with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any shout. Ilara stood alone in the grand chamber, still wearing her wedding cloak and allowed herself to feel the full weight of her isolation for the first time. The room that had seemed so magnificent only moments before now felt like a cage. She moved to the window and looked out across the territories of Iron Vein Keep, vast forests silvered by moonlight, rolling hills that seemed to stretch forever, the wild lands that were now, in some legal sense, her home. But they did not feel like home. They felt like a prison constructed from moonlight and duty, and the cold eyes of a man who had just whispered that she would never be his choice. The tears came then, hot and bitter, and she wept in a way she had not permitted herself to do since the elders had first come to her father's house with their proposal. She wept for the future she would not have, for the mate bond that would never burn with the force of true destiny, for the love that had been sacrificed on the altar of pack politics. She wept until her eyes were swollen and her throat was raw. And when finally she had no more tears to give, she sank onto the edge of the great bed and sat in the darkness, staring at nothing. What she did not know, and what would become the cruel center of her agony, was that werewolves could hear things that human ears could not. The walls of Iron Vein Keep, though thick stone, were nothing to the supernatural hearing that flowed through werewolf blood. Every member of the pack within the keep had heard Kale's words. Every one of them knew that the Alpha had rejected his Luna before the consummation of their bonding had even been considered. And in the way of packs, vicious, social, bound together by hierarchy and instinct, that knowledge would spread like poison through every heart. By morning, the shame was complete. Elara could see it in the eyes of the servants who brought her breakfast and could not meet her gaze. She could feel it in the way the female packmates, who had seemed friendly during the feast, now whispered behind their hands when she passed. She could hear it in the quality of the silence that followed her when she walked through the halls of Iron Vein Keep, as though the very stones had absorbed Kale's cruelty and now reflected it back at her from every shadow. The public humiliation reached its nadir on the third day after the wedding, in the dining hall where the pack gathered for the main meal. Elara had been attempting to maintain her composure, showing her face to the assembled members despite the weight of their collective judgment. She had dressed carefully in her dark blue-gray linen dress and her charcoal gray cloak, fastening the tarnished silver clasp with trembling fingers. She was still Luna, no matter what had been whispered. She still had status, title, position, or so she had told herself as she walked into that cavernous hall. The long tables were crowded with pack members, and conversation died as she entered, not respectfully, as would befit the Alpha's mate, but in that specific way that silence falls when the topic of the silence has just walked through the door. She moved toward the elevated table where Kale had traditionally sat, though he was absent on patrol, where any true Luna would sit. But before she could reach it, Serena Ashford rose from a chair at that very table. The woman's auburn, copper-red hair caught the light from the great fireplace, and her amber-brown eyes held a glittering amusement that made Alara's stomach clench with a terrible premonition. Serena moved with the slow grace of someone entirely assured of their place in the world. She positioned herself in the Alpha's high-backed chair. The Luna's chair, by tradition, should only be occupied by the mate of the Alpha or the Alpha himself. It was an unmistakable claim, an unmistakable challenge. "I do apologize for the presumption," Serena said, her voice pitched low enough that only the humans nearby could hear it clearly, though the werewolves, with their sharper senses, caught every word. "But I find myself unused to standing during meals, and since the current Luna seems to have no real claim on the Alpha's favor, I thought—" She smiled, an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Surely no one would object if I simply sat here instead." Ilara felt every eye in the hall fix upon her, felt the weight of their expectations, that she would fight for her position, that she would challenge Serena's disrespect, that she would do something to prove she was not the broken thing that had been rejected by her own mate. But what could she do? Rise and drag a woman from a chair? Start a physical fight in the dining hall? Those were not the responses of a composed and dignified Luna. Those were the responses of a desperate woman, and she could not give them that satisfaction. Instead, Ilara turned and walked to a different seat, several tables down from the elevated section, and sat with her back straight and her expression carefully neutral. But she could feel how that choice registered, not as dignity, but as defeat, as an acknowledgement of her lowered status, as proof that even she understood she was no longer worthy of the Luna's chair. It was Mara who came to her during that meal, the kind older woman who had been assigned to serve her from the beginning. Mara was perhaps 60, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a neat braid and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent in pack service. She had a daughter in the warrior corps and a mate who worked with the hunters. She was, by all accounts, a loyal pack member, and yet she had never shown Ilara anything but kindness, even as that kindness became increasingly conspicuous in its isolation. Mara bent close under the pretense of refilling Ilara's wine cup, and she whispered urgently, "Serena speaks openly now. The other females, they are planning to make it worse. They say that if the Alpha does not want you, then you have no right to the Luna's authority. They say you should be made to serve them instead of command them." Ilara looked at this woman who had risked her position by showing her kindness, and she felt a well of gratitude so profound it was nearly painful. "Why do you tell me this?" she asked quietly. "Because my daughter has more sense than the rest of this pack combined," Mara said. "She thinks better of you than I did, and I mean that with respect. She says any woman who endures what you have endured without striking out deserves loyalty, and I have come to believe she is right." That night, alone in her chamber, Ilara wept again, but this time there was something different in the texture of her grief. It was still raw, still agonizing, but underneath it ran a thin current of something else, defiance perhaps, or the faintest beginnings of a plan. The following week brought an even crueler form of torture. Ilara, attempting to take an evening walk in the keep's garden courtyard to gather herbs for tea, passed a small alcove where 3 pack members were engaged in what sounded like casual conversation. She would have simply continued on, but she heard her name and she stopped, frozen in place by something she could not quite name. "She will not last the winter," a female voice said. Ilara recognized it as belonging to one of the younger women, perhaps 20 years old. "The Alpha will request a formal dissolution of the bond. Wolves cannot be forced to remain with mates the other half has rejected. How long do you think before he chooses Serena formally?" This from another woman. "It is obvious where his interests lie." I heard the hunters talking. They place bets on how many months before the Luna is sent back to her people in disgrace. A male voice, rough with amusement. The betting pool is currently at 3-1 odds. She remains through winter. 5-1, she is gone. By spring equinox, I am planning to wager heavily. The Alpha has already looked at Serena twice this week in that way. She will be the new Luna within half a year, and Alara will be nothing but a shameful footnote in pack history. Alara's feet carried her away from the alcove. Before she was fully conscious of moving, she found herself running, and her delicate brown leather boots pounding against the stone floor of the keep until she found herself in the library, that vast, beautiful sanctuary that had become both her refuge and her prison. It was there that she truly broke. The library was empty. No one came here anymore, as if rejection were contagious and might spread through contact with the rejected. She sank to the floor between two towering shelves, her back against the cool stone, and allowed herself to feel the totality of her abandonment. She was not just unwanted. She was not just rejected. She was being rendered invisible, irrelevant, and the pack was calculating with mathematical precision the exact timeline of her humiliation. But as she sat there, raw and aching, her eyes fell upon a leather-bound volume that had been left carelessly on a nearby shelf. She knew this book. She had been avoiding it, in fact, because it was her mother's journal, the one her mother had pressed into her hand on the day she left for the Iron Vein territories. Her mother, who had not come to witness the wedding, had instead sent a journal filled with the preserved history of the Night Hollow clan. With trembling fingers, Alara opened it and read the words her mother had written in the front cover. My daughter, the world will teach you that a woman's value depends upon the approval of men. The world will be wrong. The old laws, which are preserved here in these pages, were written by those who understood that true power comes not from being chosen, but from choosing yourself. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, this book will teach you how. Alara read those words again and again, and something within her began to shift. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of a realization that her rejection, her isolation, her pain, these were not the end of her story. They were only the beginning of it. Her mother had known this might happen. Her mother had prepared her, in her own way, for the possibility that the pack would not value her. But her mother had also preserved something far more valuable than approval. She had preserved knowledge. She had preserved power. Kale did not appear, not that day, nor the next, nor the many days that followed. He rode out to the borders with his warriors, citing some problem with the rogue packs, and did not return for a fortnight. When he did finally come back, he moved through the keep with such careful distance that she rarely saw him. The pack understood that the Alpha had rejected his Luna, and they adjusted their hierarchy accordingly. Alara, despite her status, found herself increasingly isolated. The servants performed their duties, but volunteered nothing. The other female wolves, save for a kind older woman named Mara, who had been assigned to serve as her attendant, avoided her. The males of the pack, once they understood that Kale had no claim on her, began to regard her with a mixture of pity and something darker, as though rejection had somehow made her less worthy of basic courtesy. The weeks became months. Winter came to the Iron Vein territories, and with it came an even colder silence. Alara took to spending her days in the library of the keep, a vast, dusty chamber filled with books and scrolls that seemed to have been neglected for years. It was there, yet among the ancient texts, that she found solace. She read the old werewolf laws written in the formal script of the pre-language and translated into common tongue by scribes long dead. She studied the history of pact negotiations, the treaties between clans, the protocols for conflict resolution that predated the current system by hundreds of years. And slowly, carefully, she began to realize something that gave her the smallest grain of hope. Her knowledge of these ancient laws, knowledge that her Night Hollow clan had preserved when most packs had let them fade, might be valuable in ways that had nothing to do with her position as a rejected Luna. It might be valuable in ways that had nothing to do with Kale at all. That realization became terrifyingly, wonderfully relevant when the runners arrived from the northern territories in a storm of snow and panic. Rogue wolves, the ones who had been growing in number for years, the ones who rejected the old laws and hunted without the pack's consent, who killed for pleasure rather than sustenance, had finally made their move. They had crossed into Iron Vein territory in force, hunting down a family of civilians who had been camped near the border. 3 werewolves had been killed in the raid, and the rogues had sent a message: surrender the northern territories, or they would take them by force. War was coming. Kale called an emergency assembly of the elders and his war council. Ilara, as the Luna, was technically required to attend, though she had been excluded from most pack decision-making since the wedding. She sat in the corner of the council chamber, feeling the weight of years of rejection, and listened as experienced warriors and veteran hunters discussed strategy. They spoke of troop movements, of supply lines, of the strength of the rogue pack's numbers. But what she heard in every word was desperation. The rogue packs were growing larger, coordinating across territories in ways they had not done before, and no one in this room seemed to have a counter to that coordinated strategy. It was an old voice, finally, that broke the stalemate of the discussion. Elder Thorn, aged and weathered like old leather, leaned forward in his chair. "We have no choice but to fight," he said. "The rogues have made their intention clear. Negotiation is not possible with wolves who know no law." "And if we lose?" Kyle asked quietly. He sat at the head of the table, and even in profile, his tension was visible. "If their numbers are greater than our intelligence suggests?" No one answered. The silence was heavy with the implication of defeat. A broad-shouldered warrior, his face weathered from years of border patrol, shifted in his seat. "The girl sits in the corner like a frightened doe. No offense to the Luna, but what could she possibly contribute to war strategy? The rogues respect only strength and warriors, not..." He glanced at Ilara dismissively, then back to Kyle. "Not the rejected mate of an alpha who couldn't even control his own household before leaving to play soldier." The comment hung in the air like a blade. Ilara felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to remain still, poised, dignified. To react would be to prove him right. Elder Thorn's weathered hand raised in a subtle gesture that commanded attention. "Let her speak, Gareth," he said quietly, his tone suggesting this was a matter of protocol rather than sentiment. Ilara stood before anyone could interrupt further. The motion seemed to surprise everyone. She had been sitting quietly, and her sudden assertion of presence changed the energy of the entire room. She moved to the great map spread across the council table, the one showing the Iron Vein territories in meticulous detail, marked with the known positions of the rogue pack. Ilara heard herself speak before she had fully decided to do so. The old laws forbid exactly what the rogues are doing. The room fell silent. Kyle turned to look at her, and for the first time in months, she saw something other than cold distance in his eyes. She saw surprise, and beneath that, something else, a question. "What old laws?" asked Elder Thorn, his gaze sharpening with interest. "The Covenant of Territories," Ilara said. She stood, moving to the center of the council table with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, some place the months of rejection had not been able to reach. It was written before the division of packs, when all werewolves existed under a single law. It states that the taking of territory by force, without submission to the Council of Clans, is forbidden. More importantly, it establishes a protocol for dispute resolution that is binding upon all packs that claim the old blood. "The rogues do not claim the old blood," Kale said, and his voice was rough. "They have rejected it, but their leader did not," Ilara said. The knowledge was flowing through her now, coming from hours spent in the dusty library, from the journal that her own mother had given her years ago, a journal that documented the lineage of the Night Hollow clan and recorded every treaty, every law, every precedent that had shaped werewolf civilization. The rogue pack is led by Vex Moonshatter, who was born to the Blackthorn clan before he defected. The Blackthorn clan still holds the old blood. Therefore, Vex is subject to the covenant, whether he acknowledges it or not. She paused, gathering her thoughts. There is a law that allows for a challenger to invoke the covenant and demand a formal hearing before all the clans. If the challenger can prove that the other party has violated the covenant, the violators can be removed from the territories and essentially exiled from all packlands, their names stricken from the family records, their lineage declared void. "That would require a gathering of all the clans," Elder Thorn said slowly. "It would take weeks to assemble them. The rogues will not wait for such a process." "No," Ilara agreed. "But there is a secondary protocol. An envoy from a recognized clan can formally lodge the complaint and request a provisional enforcement of the covenant. It is meant for situations where immediate threat exists. Once the complaint is formally logged, the rogues are bound by ancient law to cease their aggression until the formal hearing can be held. To violate a provisional enforcement is to mark themselves as oath breakers, which would give cause for all the clans to unite against them without question." Kyle leaned forward. "How do you know this?" "My clan kept the records," Ilara said quietly. "We preserved the old laws when other packs let them fade, and I have spent the last month studying them in your library." Kyle's jaw clenched, and she could see the physical manifestation of his internal struggle. His hand made a fist on the table, the knuckles whitening as his mind wrestled with what she was saying. The iron wolf head buckle of his belt caught the candlelight as he leaned back in his chair, and she watched him process the implications. He had rejected her. He had allowed the pack to see her as unworthy, and now she was the only one who could save them. "The covenant," Kyle said slowly, testing the word like it might burn his tongue. "It is not a law that has been invoked in—" He paused, looking to Elder Thorn for confirmation. "In 300 years," Elder Thorn finished, "since before most of our people were born, but the law remains binding. It is carved into the ancient stone tablets in the crystalline caverns where all pack records are kept. The covenant is part of the bedrock upon which our civilization was built. Another warrior, this one older and scarred, spoke up. And if the rogues refuse to hear this envoy? If they simply kill her outright? Elara felt the room tense at this articulation of the danger she would face. She could see the calculation happening in Kyle's eyes, weighing her life against the survival of the pack. She understood with a clarity that was almost painful that he was as trapped by duty as she was, perhaps more so. Then they break the covenant openly, in front of a witness representing a recognized clan, Elara said. The violation becomes undeniable. No rogue leader could survive that. The other clans would descend on them like wolves on wounded prey. Vex is many things, but he is not foolish. He will listen, because the alternative is complete annihilation of his entire lineage. Kale's hand slowly unclenched. The tension in his jaw shifted from resistance to something more like recognition. She could see him beginning to understand that this was not just a plan. This was destiny reasserting itself in a form neither of them had anticipated. She was meant for this. Her knowledge, her training, her isolation, all of it had been preparing her for this single moment. The silence that followed felt different than the silence of rejection. This was the silence of possibility, of minds turning over new information, of ancient patterns reasserting themselves.
It would still require an envoy to go to the rogue camp, Elder Thorn said. Under a flag of parley, it would be dangerous. Vex might refuse to honor the ancient protocols.
He might, Elara agreed. But if he does, every pack will know he is no longer bound by the old blood. They will come to the Iron Vein territories with weapons drawn. The rogues would be fighting not just us, but everyone. She felt Kale's eyes on her, and she finally met his gaze. His expression was complex, pain and admiration, and something else, something she could not quite name, all moving beneath the surface like currents in deep water. An envoy would need to speak with absolute authority, he said. They would need to know the laws perfectly, know the protocols, might know how to move through a rogue camp and come out alive. They would need to represent not just the Iron Vein pack, but all the old ways. The Luna of the Iron Vein pack, who is also of the Night Hollow clan, would have that authority, Elder Thorn said slowly, and Elara understood that he was offering her a path, not just to end the war, but to reclaim herself. I will go, Elara said. No. Kale's voice was sharp, absolute. It is too dangerous. I will send a warrior, one of my best strategists. They can learn the protocols. They cannot know them as I do, Elara interrupted. Every variation, every exception, every precedent. The rogues will probe for weakness. A warrior might stumble. The daughter of the Night Hollow clan, trained from birth in our laws, will not. She saw something flash across Kale's face, pride, and beneath it, a terrible realization. She was right, and he knew it. Then I will go with you, he said. I will... No, Elara said, and the word was final. The rogue camp is expecting treachery, expecting an alpha to march in with warriors and demands. But an envoy, a woman invoking ancient law, that is something they will not have anticipated. That is what gives us advantage. The argument continued for another hour, but in the end, the logic was irrefutable. Elara would go to the rogue camp. She would invoke the Covenant of Territories. She would demand provisional enforcement, and if she succeeded, she would buy time for the packs to unite, for the old ways to reassert themselves against the new chaos. The night before she was scheduled to depart, Kale came to her chambers, and she was packing her journal, the precious record of her clan's knowledge, into a leather-bound satchel when she heard the knock. "Come in," she said, and he did, filling the doorway with his presence, his storm-gray eyes searching her face in a way that made it hard to breathe. "I cannot allow you to do this," he said, and his voice was raw with emotion she had never heard from him before. "You will be walking into the den of wolves that have already killed 3 of our own. You could die, Alara. You could die, and it would be because I failed to protect you, because I failed to appreciate what you were worth." She looked at him, at this man who had whispered that she was never his choice, and she felt something shift within her. The pain was still there. She did not know if it would ever fully leave, but beside it now was something new, something that belonged entirely to her. "You did not need to choose me," she said softly, "for this to matter, for me to matter. I am choosing this. I am choosing to fight for the pack that rejected me because it is the right thing to do. And no one, not the elders, not the pack, not even you, can take that choice away from me." Kyle moved toward her, and she did not step back. "I should have fought harder against the bonding," he said. "I should have refused. I should have—" "You are the alpha," Alara said. "Duty is different for you, as you said, but I am not the alpha. I am a woman with knowledge that might save this pack. Let me do this, Kyle. Let me be more than the Luna you never chose." He reached out and touched her face with one large, careful hand. His fingers traced her cheekbone, her jawline, lingered near her lips. "If you do not return," he whispered, "I will never forgive myself, and I will burn the rogue camps to ash in vengeance." "Then I will return," she said, "because I will not have your rage on my conscience." He kissed her then, and it was not the formal gesture of the bonding ceremony. It was desperate and fierce, and full of all the things he had never allowed himself to feel. And when he left her chambers an hour before dawn, it was with the understanding that everything had changed, not just between them, but within her. She had been given a cage, and she had decided to turn it into a key. The next morning came too soon. Alara dressed in her traveling clothes, the charcoal gray wool cloak that had become her armor, the dark blue-gray linen dress that had been worn by rejection and restored by purpose. She fastened the crescent moon pendant at her neck, feeling the cool silver against her skin like a promise made to herself. In her leather satchel, she carried her mother's journal, her own notes, copies of the ancient texts that documented the covenant. She had memorized every word, but the physical presence of the knowledge gave her strength. Kyle walked with her to the edge of the Iron Vein territories, where 3 warriors stood ready to escort her to the boundary of the Roguelands. She had insisted on going alone from that point. A woman walking into a rogue camp alone was less of a threat. A woman with armed guards was an insult, a challenge, a declaration of war rather than parley. Kale had accepted this logic, but she could see in the tight set of his jaw, in the white-knuckled grip of his hand on her shoulder, see how much that acceptance cost him. 3 days, he said. If you are not back in 3 days, I am coming for you. Then I will ensure I am back in 3 days, Alara replied. She looked up at him, at this man who had wounded her so deeply and who was now willing to let her walk into danger without him. Do not mourn me before I am gone, Kail, and do not come for me if I am not back. Honor the agreement we have made. Let the ancient laws have their chance. He pulled her close, and she felt him shake against her, whether from rage or fear or love. She could not tell. Perhaps it was all three. And then he released her, and she turned away, and she began to walk into the frozen forest alone. The journey through the forest was a descent into a world increasingly stripped of civilization. The trees grew darker and more gnarled. The snow beneath her feet was no longer clean and pristine, but marked with blood. The kills of wolves who had hunted here had taken their prey not for sustenance, but for sport. Dead birds hung from branches, eviscerated but not eaten. The waste of rogue hunting, the disrespect of the old ways. The cold seeped into her bones despite the thickness of her cloak. Her breath came in white clouds in the frozen air. The worn brown leather boots on her feet grew wet and then began to freeze as she waded through drifts of snow. Each step forward was harder than the last, and there was a moment, perhaps 2 hours into her journey, where she stopped and asked herself if she was truly strong enough for this. But then she thought of Serena Ashford sitting in the Luna's chair. She thought of the pack betting on how soon she would be sent home in disgrace. She thought of her mother's words, written in the journal that pressed against her heart. True power comes not from being chosen, but from choosing yourself. She kept walking. By nightfall, she had reached the outer markers of rogue territory, the scent marks left by wolves who had claimed this land outside the old system. She should have been terrified. Instead, she was merely cold and tired and determined. She built a small fire in a sheltered hollow, using deadwood that crackled and sparked. She did not sleep. She could not afford to sleep. Instead, she sat with her mother's journal open on her lap, and she read by firelight, and she prepared her mind for what was to come. The rogue camp was smaller than she had expected. When carved into the side of a mountain in a territory that belonged to no one, in a valley that reeked of blood and rot, snow fell more heavily here, and the ground was trampled into gray slush. She could see the crude shelters that served as housing, nothing like the civilized structures of the Iron Vein Keep. This was a place of survival, stripped to its basest form, of wolves reduced to their most primal nature. The scent of the place hit her as she crested the ridge above it, wild, feral, wrong in a way that made her stomach clench. The rogues who spotted her were exactly what she had imagined, scarred and wild, with eyes that held no recognition of the old ways, no understanding of the civilization that had been carved from the chaos of pure wolf nature. The first one who saw her shifted into his full form, a massive gray wolf, with one ear torn at the edge, with fur matted and dirty, and he howled a challenge that echoed across the valley. Alara walked toward him, not toward him exactly, but past him, down the slope and into the valley where the rogue camp sprawled. She kept her head high. She kept her pace steady. She did not run. She did not show fear. And though the wolf snarled and snapped at the air, he did not attack. There was something in her bearing that prevented violence, at least until she could be brought before whoever led this pack. 2 more rogues emerged, these ones keeping their human forms, a luxury that meant they still had some connection to civilization. even if they had chosen to reject it. They were cautious as they approached her, and one of them growled, "Who are you? What are you doing in our territory?" Ilara drew herself up to her full height, though she was smaller than them, more delicate, more obviously fragile. "I am Ilara of the Night Hollow clan," she said, and her voice rang out clear and steady, despite the cold that tried to shake it from her body. "I have come to speak with Vex Moonshatter under the protocols of the Old Blood. I invoke the Covenant of Territories." The two rogues exchanged glances. The words were ancient, formal, and they clearly registered as something significant even to wolves who had rejected the civilization from which those words had come. One of them nodded and gestured for her to follow. The interior of the rogue camp was a study in controlled chaos. Fires burned in iron braziers. Wolves, some in human form, as some halfway shifted, with features distorted in ways that suggested an unstable relationship to the transformation, moved about with the purpose of a pack that understood hierarchies, even if they rejected the old laws. She saw hunting trophies hung from crude racks. She saw bones scattered across the packed earth. She saw violence woven into every aspect of this place. Vex Moonshatter emerged from the largest structure in the camp, and her immediate impression was of age. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver streaking the dark hair of his human form. His face was scarred, one eye marked with a slash that had clearly nearly cost him his sight, and his body carried the weight of decades spent on the margins of civilization. But what struck her most was the moment of recognition that flickered across his features when he looked at her. He knew what she was before she had to explain it. He had once been part of the world she represented. "The Covenant," he said slowly, testing the word as though it were made of something precious and dangerous. "No one has invoked the Covenant in my lifetime." "Someone is doing so now," Ilara said. She stood before him, still holding her journal, still wearing her cloak with its tarnished silver clasp. She was a reminder of what he had chosen to leave behind. "I am here to formally lodge a complaint on behalf of the Iron Vein Pack and the Night Hollow clan against the Rogue Pack for violations of the Covenant of Territories." "Come," Vex said, and his tone was almost resigned. "Let us hear this accusation, but be warned, I have rejected the old ways, and so has my pack. We do not believe we are bound by laws we have chosen to abandon." They sat in a rough hall with rogues standing at a distance to watch and listen, and then Ilara began to lay out her case. She cited the specific articles of the Covenant that the Rogue Pack had violated. She documented the unprovoked raid on the civilian family, the killing of 3 Iron Vein members, the illegal territorial expansion. She quoted the exact language of the ancient laws, pulling from her memory and from the texts that her clan had preserved. And as she spoke, she watched Vex's expression shift, not to agreement exactly, but to recognition. He understood the power of the words she was speaking. He understood that whether he personally believed in the Covenant or not, enough of the werewolf world still did that his violation of it had consequences. "There is a path forward," Ilara said, reaching the conclusion of her argument. "The Covenant allows for provisional enforcement in situations of immediate threat. If you agree to a ceasefire, if you agree to submit to the formal hearing before the Council of Clans, you will not be marked as oath-breakers. You will simply be judged, as all beings should be judged by the laws their lineage claims. And if I refuse? Vex asked, though she could hear in his voice that he already knew the answer. Then every pack that still honors the old blood will move against you as oath breakers, Alara said calmly. They will not stop until your lineage is erased from the records. Your name will be spoken in curses. Your children's children will carry the shame of a covenant breaker. But if you agree, you will have the chance to make your case before the council. You will have the opportunity to argue why the old laws no longer serve your people. You might lose, but you will not lose everything. Vex was silent for a long time. Then he laughed, a bitter, rough sound that echoed through the hall. You are the Luna they rejected, he said. It was not a question. I was, Alara acknowledged. Now I am the woman who chose something better than the choice others had made for me. You have nerve, girl. I will grant you that. Vex stood, and every eye in the hall fixed on him. Let it be known, the rogue pack accepts provisional enforcement of the Covenant of Territories. We agree to a ceasefire. We will submit to the hearing before the Council of Clans. And the emissary Alara of the Night Hollow clan will depart from our territory unharmed, with full honors of safe passage. That night, in a small shelter provided by Vex himself, Alara allowed herself to finally break down. She sat alone by a small fire, and she wept, not from fear or pain, but from the sheer release of tension, from the terror that had been held at bay through force of will finally being permitted to flow through her. She had walked into a rogue camp alone. She had stood before a leader who could have killed her with a thought. She had invoked ancient law and had been heard. She had done the impossible. By morning, she was composed again, but different. Something had shifted in her during the night. She had been hollowed out by fear and filled back in with something harder, more resilient. And she was no longer the rejected Luna. She was not yet the chosen mate. She was simply herself, and that was enough. When Alara returned to Iron Vein Keep, the entire pack was assembled in the courtyard, and Kale, who had spent the 3 days of her absence in an agony of fear that aged him years, fell to his knees when he saw her emerge from the forest with the rogue runners who had accompanied her under the flag of truce. The return to Iron Vein Keep changed everything in ways that were impossible to hide from the pack. As news spread, word carried by the rogue runners who had escorted her back whispered in the taverns and hunters' halls. The narrative shifted. The rejected Luna had not come back broken or defeated. She had come back transformed, victorious, necessary. In the great hall where she had once been spurned, as the women who had whispered behind their hands now stood with their heads bowed in something that looked like shame. Serena Ashford did not appear in the communal spaces for 3 days after Alara's return, a withdrawal that was itself a form of acknowledgement. The men who had placed bets on her humiliation began to understand that they had bet against the wrong woman. Mara, her loyal attendant, wept when she saw her. You did it, she said simply. You actually did it. You saved us all. But Alara shook her head. I saved the pack, she said quietly. That is different than saving ourselves. The real work comes now, understanding why we thought it was acceptable to reject someone before we had even given them a chance to prove their worth. That first night after her return, Kyle came to her chambers again. This time, it was not with doubt or conflict in his features. He knelt before her, an act of extraordinary humility for an alpha. and he took her hands in both of his. I was wrong, he said. The words seemed to cost him something, but his voice did not waver. I was wrong to accept the arrangement without fighting for the possibility that we might become more than duty. I was wrong to make you into a symbol of political necessity instead of seeing you as a woman worthy of genuine regard. And I was wrong to believe, even for a moment, that my rejection of you was somehow a mercy to us both. Ilara looked down at the man kneeling before her, this alpha who had caused her so much pain and who was now demonstrating a capacity for growth that few werewolves ever achieved. She could see the scar through his left eyebrow, could see the vulnerability in the set of his jaw, could feel the trembling in his hands as he held hers. I hear you, she said. I believe your words are genuine, but I need you to understand something important. I did not do what I did to earn your forgiveness. I did it because I discovered that my value does not depend on your recognition of it, and my choice to be with you now is not a validation of your regret. It is a choice I am making because, having discovered my own strength, I have chosen to see strength in you as well. The courage to admit error, the willingness to be changed by what another has taught you. That night, in the council chamber, with every elder and warrior present, he spoke his absolute rejection of the narrative that had made her a rejected Luna. He spoke of her knowledge, her bravery, her wisdom. He spoke of the fact that she had walked into certain danger and had returned with peace, not the peace of surrender, but the peace of the old laws reasserting themselves. And then, in front of them all, he said the words that made her heart finally break open. If she had chosen me, I would have been the luckiest wolf in any territory. The fact that I was too blind to see her worth when she was given to me is a failure I will spend the rest of my life correcting. Ilara Night Hollow. He paused, and there were tears in his eyes. Will you forgive me for being so foolish as to think I had any say in your value? The council chamber held its breath, and Ilara, standing before the man who had whispered that she was never his choice, before the pack that had shunned her, before the future that had somehow become hers to shape, I made the only choice that mattered. I forgive you, she said quietly, but I did not do this for forgiveness. I did this because I am stronger than the rejection. I am more than the Luna of another's choosing. I am myself, and I have decided that I choose you, not as a duty, not as a binding, but as a woman who has learned her own value and who has chosen to share that with a man worthy of it. He rose as he spoke, pulling her up with him, and the council chamber erupted into a sound that was part howl, part cheer, a primal acknowledgement of the truth that had just been spoken. Ilara could see tears streaming down Elder Thorn's weathered face. She could see Mara, standing at the back of the chamber, pressing her hands to her heart. But it was not over. Kyle stepped forward, and the room quieted. His hand, and with its heavy iron ring catching the firelight, reached out and grasped Ilara's gently at first, then with more certainty. In the old ways, he said, there is a ritual for true mate bonds, not the ceremonial binding that was forced upon us by politics and necessity, but the binding that comes from choice, from recognition, from the decision to build something together that is not mandated by law, but created by will. He drew her closer, his stormy gray eyes never leaving hers. Ilara Night Hollow, I bind myself to you, not as your alpha, though I am alpha, but as your mate, chosen freely, respected fully, and honored without reservation for all the days of my life. I recognize your power. I acknowledge your wisdom, and I commit myself to earning the right to stand beside you again and again for as long as the moon rises. The words I spoken in the formal cadence of ancient ritual seemed to reshape the very air of the council chamber. This was the real binding. This was what true love sounded like in the old language. And Alara, understanding what she was being offered and what acceptance would mean, opened her own heart. I bind myself to you, Kyle Ironvein, she said, and her voice rang with clarity and certainty. Not because I was given to you, but because, having walked through fire alone and discovered my own strength, I have chosen to walk forward with you. I see your capacity for growth. I honor your willingness to acknowledge where you have failed, and I commit myself to being a Luna, not of your making, but of my own, and to standing beside you as an equal, not a possession. When he kissed her then, it was in front of the entire pack. It was not a secret act done in private chambers. It was a public declaration, a sacred moment, a transformation witnessed by everyone who had once whispered that she would never be worthy of the Alpha's regard. And as the pack's song rose again, that ancient, primal harmony that seemed to come from the very earth itself, Ilara felt something settle within her. The cage had become a key, and that key had opened a door to a future that was entirely, gloriously her own. The rogue crisis passed into history. The Council of Clans gathered, and Vex Moonshatter, bound by the ancient laws, submitted to judgment and was ultimately exiled from all pack territories. His name struck from the records, his lineage severed. But Ilara's name was added to those records in a new way, not as a rejected Luna, but as the woman who had brought the old laws back to life, as the one who had chosen her own strength, as a mate who had been earned, not given. In the years that followed, the Ironvein pack and the Night Hollow clan grew closer, their union real and true rather than political. And every werewolf in those territories knew the story of how their Luna had been given to their Alpha as a duty, and how she had transformed that cruel binding into the most powerful magic of all, the choice to be more than what others had made of her, and the grace to forgive those who had been too blind to see her worth before they learned to look.